Hi there. Welcome to Activism is Medicine Roundtable. My name is Frank Ferencich, and today we're excited to welcome author and speaker Derrick Jensen. Derrick has been called the poet laureate of the environmental movement, and he's the author of many books, including Deep Green Resistance, Endgame, The Culture of Make-Believe, The Myth of Human Supremacy, and most recently, Bright Green Lies. I hope you enjoy it. All good?
Yep.
Yeah. Well, Derrick Jensen, welcome to Activism is Medicine, and we're delighted to have you on with us. And I've got a lot of things to talk about, but I thought we'd start out with maybe a look at your personal history, kind of the arc of your career, where it's leading you in the domain of activism, and what you see happening right now on the planet and in the activist community. So, and then I have a bunch of questions after that, but that would be a good way to begin, I think.
So I think for me, I probably became, well, I was going to say I became an environmentalist in second grade, but that's not really true. I think part of the reason that I became an environmentalist, oddly, has to do with the fact that I was raised Seventh-day Adventist. And the reason I say this is because on Saturdays, we were not to do Friday night and Saturday. You're not supposed to do things like shop or watch cartoons. I never watched cartoons as a kid. Couldn't watch NCAA football. And instead, my family would, or I personally would be out in the wild. And so that I left being an Adventist in high school, but I think the thing that I regret the most was leaving that thing where you don't do any shopping on Saturday, because or you don't do any work too. You don't do capital W work. So that, I think, it's just, they had many bad ideas, but that was a good one. And so I spent a lot of time in nature as a kid. And then the second grade thing was they put in a subdivision right next to where I lived. And I wondered, if they keep doing this, where will the meadowlarks go? And where will the cottonwood trees go? And where will the garter snakes go? And the ants and the grasshoppers? And that was the language I did have. The language I didn't have at the time, but the understanding I had, is that you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. And one reason I like to say that is that most of the problems we face are not particularly cognitively challenging. They can be emotionally challenging, but they're not cognitively challenging.
Right.
You know, for example, if you have uncountable salmon, and then you can count them, and then you have 500,000, then you have 200,000, I mean, anybody can see that this is going in the wrong direction. And so anyway, second grade, I realized, without having the language, that you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. And then we'll fast forward to college, when I got a degree in physics, but I didn't really enjoy it that much. And I would ask around my fellow students, and if they were enjoying college, and most of them said no. And when I said, well, you know, we only really, that we know of, get to live once. And so what do you think about the fact that you're not really enjoying what you're doing? And the answers were pretty unanimous, which was, when I get out of here, I'm going to buy a nice car. And I realized that I didn't want to spend my life doing things I didn't want to do. And what the larger question that I couldn't articulate at the time there is, who is served by the system? And I didn't have the answers to this, but I just knew, you know, I would go to work, and my dogs would be lying in the grass, and I would come home from work, and my dogs would be lying in the grass in the sunshine. And I'm thinking, yeah, clearly all of evolution took place so that we can go to jobs we don't like. And so I was just questioning what I was getting at. And I didn't come up with this language. I didn't have this language for decades later, till decades later. But it's sort of Max Weber's famous quote about in the past, the man was first, in the future, the system shall be first. Or it's also anticipating Lewis Mumford's notion of authoritarian techniques, where the technologies really are in charge. And before you think I'm crazy about that, I just want to say about, first off, read Lewis Mumford, he's great. But second, he talks about authoritarian techniques and how they lead to certain technologies will lead to certain power structures. Like, for example, mining is one of the first forms of slavery because it's such a horrible existence. And then in addition, you can't just have mining without any of the consequences that go with it. Excuse me, because once you have mining, that first off means you have to steal the land from people whose land it is. Second, you have to steal the lives of the people who work in the mines. Third, you have to have a system of policing, because once you have the ore, it's worth something and people are going to steal it. And you have to have a system of military and police to protect the ore at every stage of the traveling till it gets to its final consumption point. So he says that certain technologies lead to certain power structures. And then he also says that these technologies get to be in charge themselves. And before you think that's crazy, think, are cities designed for human beings or are they designed for cars? And does the government take better care of human beings or take better care of corporations, which are human inventions? And so I didn't have any of that language, but I sort of had the inchoate feeling in my guts during college that there's something wrong here. Okay, so now let's fast forward to when I'm 25 and I recognize that everything's messed up, that I don't know what's going on. Everything's just, and the problems are too big. I can't do anything about them. So I don't do anything, like many people. And then one day I realized, okay, here's something I can do. I'm not paying enough for gasoline. And so I need to make a tithe that every dollar I spend on gas, I need to give $1 to a local environmental organization. But I wasn't really making any money. So I could also have the possibility of I could pay myself $5 an hour to do activism. So if I fill the tank, which in 1985 or 86 cost $10, if I fill the tank, that means I have to either give $10 to a local environmental organization, or I have to do 2 hours worth of activism. And so that's how I got started as an activist, really. But I went from sitting on my butt, which is, I've done so many interviews, I've interviewed people and activists. And one of the questions I always ask or often ask is, how did you get activated? How did you go from sitting on your butt to actually doing something? And for me, that's the story. It's like, I'm overwhelmed. I can't do anything. And there's a line, it's really silly, but it's a great line by my mother's grandmother. So my great grandmother used to say to my mom, and then my mom said to me, yard by yard, life's hard, inch by inch, life's a cinch. And so I don't try to eat this whole monster in one bite. I just take bite after bite. Another way to say this is I've written 28 books or something, but I haven't actually written 28 books because I can't write a book because that's too big and scary.
Right.
It's terrifying to think of writing a book. But what I can do is I can write a page, and then I can write another page tomorrow. And then the day after that, I can write another page. And then maybe a week later, I'll write another page. And before you know it, I've got a book. And it's the same with the activism. I can't stop this culture from killing the planet. But what I can do is I can go today to participate in this anti-circus demo. That was one of the first things I did. First thing I did was write letters to the editor. And then I started I went to an anti-circus demo. I didn't even know why they're bad. I just knew they're bad. And I showed up and they handed me a sign. I'm just standing there. Circuses are bad. And some guy comes up to me and says, why are circuses bad? And I said, talk to the guy next to me. It's like, I love this line by Florence Nightingale, that I attribute my success to the fact that I never gave nor accepted an excuse. And so I was going to do 2 hours a week of activism, no excuses. And so I did anti-military. There was Fairchild Air Force Base, was not very far from where I lived. So I'd stand out there with signs saying nukes are bad, and that's how I started. And then I went from there to timber sale appeals. And then pretty soon I was having so much fun with the activism that I quit keeping track. But anyway, that's how I started as an activist. And then how I got to the sort of deeper analysis. Well, first off, we go back to second grade where I recognize you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. And then when I was a baby activist, 28, 29, working with various forest activists, I saw this really interesting disjuncture, which was that in public, they would, and I totally understand this, I'm not blaming them at all. They would say, okay, we need to stop this particular timber sale because it violates this law or that law. That's great. They would do anything they could to protect a particular piece of ground. In private, they would admit that they were basically holding on by their fingernails, trying to protect this or that piece of ground until civilization collapsed. That basically they didn't talk about the larger analysis because that would destroy their credibility to try to protect this or that place. But in private, almost all of them were quite explicit that unless it's stopped, this culture will kill everything it can. And I thought, somebody's got to say it in public. And of course, I'm not the first person to say it in public. Lewis Mumford was saying it. Mencius was saying it. Plato, for God's sake, was saying it. Again, this is not cognitively challenging. I don't know how to say it. Caraccitus or something like that was saying it. This has been said. Tecumseh was saying it. But I figure I may as well add my voice to theirs and do this larger analysis. So that's sort of the quick. Then I guess I'll go a little bit more, which is one reason I wrote my book Endgame is because I would do talks, and at talks, I would ask the question, do you believe this culture will undergo a voluntary transformation to a sane and sustainable way of living? Mm. Nobody ever said yes. One person one time at one of the talks raised his hand and he looked around. I said, oh, voluntary. No, of course not. And what I take from that is that we will have a transformation to a sane and sustainable way of living, or we won't continue to live by definition. But will it be voluntary? I don't think so. Every cell in my body wants for it to be voluntary. Every cell in my body wants that. But will it be? I don't think so. So the next question is, if you don't believe that it's going to be voluntary, what does that mean for your strategy and for your tactics if you care about wild nature? And the answer is, for the most part, we don't talk about it. And the reason we don't talk about it is because we're all so busy pretending that there will be this transformation that we all know in our hearts isn't going to happen. And that doesn't mean, by the way, not believing there's going to be a voluntary transformation doesn't mean that you give up and sit on your hands at all. It just means that, excuse me, you reevaluate your strategy and your tactics. Anyway, so that's sort of the thumbnail sketch.
Nice, nice.
Wow.
Well, maybe we can talk a little bit about Bright Green Lies, about the book and the concept and the reception that it's received.
Sure. So that book started because there was an editor at Orion who didn't like me, and excuse me, I did a column for Orion for, I don't know, 10 years or something, and the editor I worked with really liked me. There was another one who didn't like me, and he tried to set up this debate between me and a bright green person. In fact, the guy who developed the term bright green, that he thinks that the transformation to wind and solar will save the planet, and they're actually good for the planet, and that we can, with only tinkering around, we can have a sustainable industrial society. And so I agreed to do the interview, or I agreed to do the debate, but I agreed on the condition that it would be done in writing. And the reason I wanted to do it in writing is that if he made false claims, I wanted to be able to research them. And if it's a verbal debate right now, like I could tell all of you right now, ABC is true. And unless you happen to know that that's not true, there's nothing you can do except, desperately start Googling or something. So I agreed to do it only if it was written. And we started that debate, and the other guy quit after my first set of comments and said, no, we have to do it verbally. I said, okay, we'll do it verbally, but on the condition that I get veto power, that it doesn't get printed if I don't like it. I'm house sitting. Well, I'm semi-house sitting, and there are between my dogs and the other person's dogs, there's 9 dogs here.
Wow.
So anyway, so we did the verbal thing, and just as I expected, he made some whopper claims. Like he said, it's possible to live. It's possible to have this way of living with 100% metals recycling. And in the debate itself, I didn't know the numbers, but when we got off the phone, I looked it up. And again, I don't know the numbers exactly, but I'm making up numbers here, but the idea is correct. That just a second.
Who let the dogs out?
We're in.
I know the feeling.
And once they get
Okay, so I don't know the exact numbers, but that's basically true. That the copper, for example, is one of the most recyclable metals, and currently something like 70 or 80 or 90% of copper is recycled. But the demand is such that you still have to, that recycled copper only makes up, I don't know, 40% of the copper used. So the only way that you could have, excluding the tremendous energy that goes into recycling metals, excluding the toxic waste associated with recycling metals, excluding transportation, everything else, your economy would still have to be contracting by X% a year to be able to make that work. I mean, just the physics, the numbers aren't there. So that was what really got me started on Bright Green Lies. Is like, he was making all these claims that are just, they're nice sound bites, but if you do the actual research, they're not true. And you find this all through the whole Bright Green. So I should define Bright Green. Bright Green is the idea that through technology, you can make this culture sustainable. And as Jeff Gibbs says in Planet of the Humans, they're basically arguing that you can use the machines of civilization to stop the harms of civilization.
right.
And it's it all struck me as just transparently not accurate. And so I set out to write that book. And at first I was going to write it, and then I don't know if this is true for the three of you, but as I've gotten older, my energy is declining. And so Max and Lierre came on. Lierre for her great writing, and both of them for their great thinking. They're both brilliant people. And then also Max did the core of the actual primary research. So the way we would write the book is that he would do a lot of the research, present it to us in a very usable and very well written and very well thought out form, and then I would tweak it. And we would all three work together on the analysis. But I want to talk a couple more things about that. One of them is that another thing we wanted to really hit is that there are a couple things that we really needed to hit in that book, which one of them is that all of the mainstream solutions to global warming all have one thing in common, which is that they take industrial capitalism as a given, and and the natural world is having to conform to industrial capitalism. And that's solving for the wrong variable. That's that's literally insane in terms of being out of touch with reality, because any way of life, because without a living planet, you don't have any social structure. So your social structure must be dependent upon the health of the natural community, what a lot of people call ecosystems, must be dependent upon the health of the land and the water and so on. And so Bill McKibben, as I was writing the book, he wrote me a note. It's very nice. It's a very, very pleasant note saying, I've heard you're saying bad things about me behind my back. And I would hope that you would have the respect for me, that if you're saying bad things about me behind my back, that you would say them to my face. I went back to him and said, I'm not saying anything bad about you behind your back. In fact, I think no one has done more to raise awareness of global warming than you have. You've been tireless, etc. The problem I have is that you are explicit that what you're attempting to save is civilization. And I am explicit that what I'm attempting to save is the natural world. And those two goals are at odds.
Right.
And so this attempt to save civilization over saving the planet has also harmed, I believe, environmentalism. And an example of that is that you can get 10,000 people or 50,000 people or something marching on the streets of New York or Boston or Paris or something. And if you ask them why they're marching, they'll say, we're marching to save the planet. And if you ask them for their specific demands, they'll say, we want subsidies for the wind and solar industries. And I can't think of any other mass social movement that has been turned into a lobbying arm for a sector of industrial capitalism. And it's horrifying. I'm not saying anything about, for one thing, I'm not talking about Extinction Rebellion. Just want to be clear about that. I'm not talking about grassroots environmental organizations. I'm not talking about some of the biocentric organizations, but the mainstream organizations have gone all in on this. And some of them end up supporting some atrocious, they support mining for as long as it's done. I don't remember who said this. It was some environmentalist or another. It was great. Said, oh no, it was Ozzie Zenner, I believe, said that in his really good book, Green Illusions, really good book. Anyway, he said that environmentalists are generally against batteries unless you put them into automobiles, and then suddenly the environmentalists are in favor of giant batteries. And so there's been, even among a lot of organizations that were biocentric, end up having this split attitude of, yeah, we're against copper mines, but what are we going to do about lithium mines? Because we support electric vehicles. It ends up being, anyway, so bright green lines. I want to talk about another problem with the whole bright green thing, which is not only does it not help the planet, and we can talk about that. I just sort of stated it, but I can defend it if you want me to. Not only does wind and solar, et cetera, not help the planet, but they also are functionally incapable of doing what the bright greens claim of saving civilization. And a great example of that is the so-called German miracle that they talked about, where McKibben and Naomi Klein and others would say, they get all excited because 50% or 80% or some huge percent of energy was supplied by renewables last week or yesterday or whenever it was. And there's a bunch of problems with them saying that. One is, it was for like 1 hour on a windy, sunny day on a Sunday when manufacturing is at the lowest, and so demand's at the lowest. But also, and it was for 1 hour, but also the bigger problem is they're confusing energy versus power. And power is electricity. Energy is total use of energy. And for any economy, the general rule is about 20% of your total energy is power, is electricity. And so when they said, wow, 50% of it was renewables, okay, first off, a lot of that was biomass, which is just cutting down trees and burning them. Second, they're only talking about electricity. They're not talking about semi tractors, big semis on the highway. They're not talking about the oil burning heaters for big buildings. They're not talking about coal. All they're talking about is electricity. And so in LA, it's interesting. The city of Los Angeles and all sorts of universities have made these pledges to go 100% renewable energy. And it's like, sorry to be a pedant, but no, you're actually pledging to go 20% renewable energy because you're pledging to go 100% renewable electricity. And probably got problems with renewable too. As Ozzy Zenner says, you have the oil, you have fossil fuels, and you have alternative fossil fuels. But leaving that aside for a moment, again, it's only 20%. And I have a number here that shows how this isn't going to work, which is, I believe it's about 44, which is the megajoules per kilogram in diesel. It could be 48, could be 45, somewhere in there. Remember the number mid 40s. Megajoules per kilogram, doesn't matter. It just means how much energy per unit of weight or mass. Now, lithium batteries are like 1.5, 2, something like that. So the point is, you can have a semi can go 600 miles on a tank of diesel with a 60,000 pound payload. To go that same 600 miles, you'd have to have like 55,000 pounds of batteries, which means you have a 5,000 pound payload, which means there's no point to go long distance. Sure, you can do it around the city. It's fine to have it for, going around a dock, but oil, coal are functionally irreplaceable at that level to maintain civilization, which is not something I want to do. But if that's your stated goal, it's still not going to work. Right. So that's a problem. I don't understand. And it's fine. It's fine. It's absolutely fine if your next door neighbor or a neurosurgeon or a baseball player doesn't know the difference between power and energy. But if you're the energy reporter for the LA Times reporting on these issues, you better know the difference between energy and power. Right. And it's the same if you're Bill McKibben or Naomi Klein and you're writing books about it. You should know that difference. And because it makes the claims, it's much different to say, wow, we had 50% of energy versus we had 10% of energy. It's a big, big difference. And so we talk about that. We talk about, and here's another thing people don't talk about. They talk about energy storage for this. We talk about lithium batteries. I didn't know this till we wrote the book. We talk about the batteries are terrible. We talk about batteries, talk about all sorts of storage like that. On the grid scale, do you know what 99% of the storage is pumped hydro, which means big dams. You have 2 dams, and you basically, when you have the wind blowing, you pump the energy up, and then when the wind's not blowing, you let it flow back down and through tunnels. And so their answer, the environmental answer to this is more big dams. And really? And so we go through all the numbers like that. We go through the numbers on if they had this big transition that they want to do, how much extra mining it would take. It's like 4 years, I'm making up the numbers. It was like 4 years worth of the world's mining for iron, or 2 years, or, I'm sorry, more mining is not going to save the planet.
Nice.
Anyway, so that's a quick bright. And if you want more specifics on bright green lies, I'm glad to go there, but that's the overview.
Right. Well, gentlemen, John, JLo, you want to jump in here with anything?
I had I had 2 questions. One, and I just want to give you a hypothetical because I'd be interested in your theoretical arguments. There's here in California, you may be familiar with, actually it's Nevada, with Burning Man. Okay, and the Burning Man group has recently taken the position they're opposing a thermal project on indigenous lands, to taking the argument that we don't really need another thermal project here, and that we want to protect, which is essentially indigenous and rural land. And people are objecting to that, saying, well, wait a minute, you're supposed to be concerned about alternative energy. What's the fundamental underlying argument that would say the thermal project really isn't worth doing?
For me, it all comes down to value and what I value. And I value wild nature over increased energy usage. And it's funny, I am sometimes classified as a misanthrope, but I'm not really, because all of my work is based on, I can sum up all the work by this way of living won't last. And when it's over, I would prefer there's more of the world left rather than less. So, and I just want to say that if I were made president, or if I were made, supreme dictator, I wouldn't cause an economic and technological collapse overnight. I would have degrowth. I would start with things. I mean, I like baseball, but retractable stadium roofs are ridiculous. And there is as much water used by municipal golf courses as used by municipal human beings. And I would ban golf, which of course would get me clubbed to death. And so I would ask, does the world really need this thermal plant? Why? What will it be used for? And if the answer, oh, here's another problem. I need to talk about this. This is really important. Is that something that the Bright Greens really ignore is something called Jevons paradox. And Jevon, so I take it you know about this. So Jevons paradox, for other listeners, is that he was an economist in the 19th century who studied coal coal use. And he had the question, if increased efficiency in coal use, what does that do for demand? And you would think at first that would cause demand to go down, because if you only need half as much coal to cook dinner or to heat your house, you only have to buy half as much.
Right.
And that may be true on a personal level, maybe, but on a business level, it's not how it works. It actually increases demand. Increased efficiency in the use of coal leads to increased demand, because now that particular cost has gone down. You can expand your business. You can find more uses for it. It's cheaper, so more people are going to buy it for all sorts of different things. Suddenly you can, they're doing this in Texas. They're putting air conditioners outside. They're air conditioning their backyards. And you can only do that if gas is, if electricity is way too cheap. So any increased efficiency in energy usage usually means increased demand. And it's the same for every type of energy that we use. So at first, humans only used muscle energy, human muscle energy, enslaved human muscle energy, enslaved non-human muscle energy, oxen, etc. Also they had wood back then. They would burn wood. And then eventually, we'll skip thousands of years, eventually they added coal, but coal use did not decrease the use of wood. And then when they added oil, that didn't decrease the use of coal. When they added hydro, that didn't decrease the use of any of the others. All of them add on. And what precisely is happening with wind, solar, all of those others? It's adding on. It's not replacing.
Right.
And I'm going to come back to your question in a second, John.
Okay.
But George Monbiot had this great line about why he doesn't support wind and solar and why he believes nuclear is the answer. Because, and I'm not agreeing with George Monbiot. It's a great line, sort of in quotes. It's a great line to parry. And he says that the reason he doesn't believe in wind and solar, but he instead believes in nuclear, is how else are we going to get the energy that we need to run our brick factories? Now I'm going to change a couple words and see how this sounds. how else are the capitalists going to get the energy they need to run their brick factories? It's not my brick factory. It's not my, whatever factories are going, whatever semiconductor factories or whatever factories they're going to build there, they're not mine, or they're going to use the energy for. It's not mine.
Right.
So I would argue, who's going to use the energy for what? And how does that help the natural world? How does it help? I mean, that's my base question for everything, is how does it help the natural world? And I don't see how it does. And people can make the argument, oh, but I want the energy because I want that'll drop my electric bill by 5 cents a month or $5 a month or $50 a month or whatever. And that's fine that they make the argument, but somebody has to be an unalloyed advocate for wild nature. And that's going to be me. And I'm going to say, so my argument is going to be, no, how does that help desert tortoises? It doesn't.
Right.
How does it help migratory songbirds? It doesn't. And, Bill McKibben did a thing that this is the moment that Keith, one of my co-authors and my dear friend, said about when she gave up on Bill McKibben, is he said the choice is not between bats and birds and wind energy. The choice is between wind energy and coal. And it's like, you don't get to write off all of nature that way. So that's so I would argue a couple of things. One of them is I would argue who benefits, and I would argue nature doesn't benefit, and I would argue that I started to say a thing about being called a misanthrope. I'm not, because I want for the people who come after us to not inherit hell. And so I don't think so that, and then also, I mean, you asked this about a place, and I don't know if I'm misreading you or if you're not particularly happy with my answer, but I can't give a more specific answer because I don't know the project. But if I were local and fighting the project, I would be fighting it on endangered species ground, on Clean Air Act, on Clean Water Act, on zoning. I got no problem with using all those rules. And in fact, that's where it goes. Philosophically, I answered it first. And then technically, if I was local, those are all the things I'd argue. And then there's a question, those are sort of legal arguments or planning arguments or permitting arguments. And then there's it's like, who am I arguing with? Because also I recognize that when I was a very, very young activist, I went to a Forest Service meet and greet, and I spent 3 hours arguing with another person at the meet and greet about whether clear cuts are bad or not. And what he did for a living was run a drive-in movie theater. And when I left that evening, I realized, it's like, even if I would have changed his mind, it doesn't really matter because he's not a decision maker. And neither one of us was going to change our mind based on arguing for 3 hours. So a lot of times what I do is I just make my point and then I walk away. If it's regular people, if it's a decision maker, yeah, I'll get in their face and go down the line. So if you want me to modify my answer, if you want to shade the question a little bit, I'm happy to give you another answer.
No, I'm very pleased with the answer, and I wanted the general context.
Okay, great.
I didn't mean to, I perhaps put in too much specificity.
Okay, great.
Here's my second question. And again, I'm looking for a big picture that I think we all of us here today agree that our current civilization is in serious trouble. And that it may, certainly it isn't going to survive in its present context. But as the collapse begins, it seems to many people that one of the responses will be authoritarianism or fascism. Here's a problem we need to deal with. What structures or plans would you propose during this collapse process to ensure the best possible result?
I think that's another great question. And part of the answer for me is manifest in the COVID lockdowns, because, and I'm not talking about, was this a Bill Gates theory, or, I'm not talking about any of that. I'm just talking about what happened. I got really interested in the whole COVID thing 10 days, I believe it is, after Wuhan shut down, when a Hyundai factory in Korea shut down 10 days after Wuhan closed. And it struck me as extraordinary that one city shutting down, big city shutting down a couple thousand miles away, affected this plant over here within 10 days. And the point is that a global, okay, I'm going to give another example, and then I'm going to go to what I mean. That I was talking with a guy maybe 6 months ago who does, Tony, come here. Tony, come here. I was talking with a guy about 6 months ago who does sort of strategic global relations stuff, and especially with regard to the global economy collapsing. And he's from Dubai, I believe, or UAE. Is Dubai part of UAE? Anyway, he's from UAE, and he had been talking recently to a very high-level security person in South Korea about if the United States and China were to go to war, what would South Korea's military do? And when he said, and the South Korean guy was saying, we'll do this, we'll do this. And I was like, no, you won't. Because if the United States and China go to war, South Korea has no oil. Your tanks will be sitting in the streets, not moving, because it gets its oil from the Middle East, which goes right past China. It's just not going to happen. And which, by the way, one of my favorite gotcha questions is, when did Japan lose World War II? Well, when they lost Midway. It's like, no, they lost World War II the moment they started it, because you can't, there was no way, literally no way they could compete with US oil and US steel. It's just, the war's over as soon as it started. And my point here is that it strikes me as, forgetting the natural world, it strikes me as monumentally stupid to outsource necessaries for living. It strikes me as absolutely ridiculous to import food from South America, and to import food from China or from anywhere. It doesn't matter. I'm not talking about politics. I'm talking about if a virus or anything else can interdict a supply, that means a war can interdict a supply, an earthquake can interdict a supply, a shortage of oil can interdict a supply, a hurricane can interdict a supply. So what I would do is localize food systems, and then localize food systems, and then after that, you localize food systems. Because without food, you die. And so one of the most important things we can do as we prepare for this oncoming fascism from both left and right, the authoritarianism from both left and right, as we prepare for that, we localize food systems, we localize other necessary systems as much as possible. I mean, it's pretty interesting. So where I live is a redwood rainforest, Crescent City, California, and it's not going to burn here, but 20 miles up the canyon, it burns every couple of years. And this last summer, there was a fire up in the Smith River Canyon, as there often is, and this year it burned out the electrical, the things, the pylons that hold up the electrical wires. So Crescent City was out of electricity for a couple, 3 weeks, maybe a month, maybe 2 months. They brought in generators. But the point is, That struck me as extraordinary, that they don't have that much redundancy in the grid to circle it around. That seems like a really stupid way to make a grid,
Yeah.
especially through a canyon that burns every 2 or 3 years. So, you know, and I'm not defending industrial electricity here. I'm just saying that what I would do is I would localize everything I can to make it so an authoritarian system cannot get that hold. I mean, on a larger level, Kropotkin famously remarked that so many revolutions have foundered because of bread. You can have whatever politics you want, but if people can't eat, they're going to go back to the other side. And as Daniel Quinn said, that one of our fundamental problems is that we have been made reliant for our very lives on the system that's killing the planet. And so there's the relocalizing. Another thing that's really important in my book, Culture and Make Believe, one of the things I was very pleased with is I predicted the rise of the sort of militant, xenophobic right as economies collapse. So when economies collapse, the right goes crazy. The thing I whiffed on completely was that when the economies collapse, then the left goes crazy too. And it's interesting because I wrote a book about that in 2012, and that book cost me much. The first book, Culture Make Believe, was longlisted for a major literary prize. Longlisted means it didn't make the short list, so it's not official, but industry insiders told me that I was down to 10, not 5. So I almost won an award for talking about how the right goes crazy when the economy collapses. And then I write one about how the left goes crazy when the economy collapses in 2012, and all my publishers dumped me and never got published, which is part of the problem with the left. Anyway, the point though is that the time. I hope you can edit these out. Either that or leave them in for comic relief or something. Anyway, so what we need to do, the time to prepare for that is now. The time to learn self-defense, the time to, I mean, as I say about women, the time to learn self-defense is not when somebody's breaking down your door. The time to learn self-defense is beforehand. And so the time to learn community self-reliance is now. You know, I raised chickens when I lived in Spokane because I wanted to be able to do it when I could still go to Albertsons for groceries, and I could make all the mistakes that are necessary that you always make when you're starting to do something. And so the time to learn self-sufficiency is when you can always go to the grocery store. So there is that self-sufficiency, the community self-sufficiency, community self-reliance, get to know your neighbors, there's all that stuff. And also make your allegiance to, see, I used to be able to say with a straight face, make your allegiance to various oppressed groups, absolute. But the way the left has gone crazy, that I'm not comfortable saying anymore either, because it has led into sort of identity politics that ignores many other things. But the point is that to prepare for that fascism is as the country folk like to say, read a book. So read history. You know, I find it very interesting to read about Weimar Germany and how, and also the World War I reparations, all that stuff leading to the insanity of Nazi Germany. There's a phrase I hear on the right sometimes that is both horrifying and also makes sense, is, and then one day, for no reason anyone could understand, ... And it's the ... is the Nazis came to power. Because there's this this complete. Anyway, so my point is, what do we do now to prepare for that? Self-sufficiency, community self-sufficiency, get to know your neighbors, form you know, one of the things I like to say is that, for example, as men, we need to make our loyalty to women, and we need to make collectively. So that's why the identity politics thing is bothering me, is collectively, we as white people need to make our allegiance to Black people. We need to make our allegiance to the very suppressed. And the problem I have with the identity politics is there are people who interpret that as we have to agree with every single person, every single Black person. I mean, everything every single Black person does. And that ends up being just a different form of madness. So anyway, I think what we do collectively, and also we talk about it, you know, the R.D. Laing has the 3 rules of a dysfunctional family, which also 3 rules of a dysfunctional culture, which is rule A is don't. Rule A1 is rule A does not exist. And rule A2 is never discuss the existence or non-existence of rules A1, or A2. So I think what we do is we talk as honestly as we can about the circumstances we find ourselves in, and we ask the question you just asked. I think asking that question, and we ask it in public, like, what are we going to do about the impending authoritarianism on the right and the left? What are we going to do about the necessary relationship between wealth inequality and fascism? That's another thing I think we on the left need to. So I got this line from Matt Walsh of all people. And we all know who Matt Walsh is. He said this line he's a freaking right-wing conservative Christian. And he said that part of the problem is that the left has given up on dealing with wealth inequality. And then all they're left with is this identity politics. And it's like, okay, and I have to make the obligatory thing. Trump is horrible. Yeah. Of course I believe that. But I was appalled when Hillary Clinton called Trump voters deplorables. At one point, that was part of the left's demographic. They're called working class, blue collar people. And this goes back, sorry to go on about this so long, but this really gets at me, that I did an interview in the late 90s or late 90s with this guy, Joel Dyer, who wrote a book called Harvest of Rage about how the farm crisis had led to an increase in right-wing militants. And he put the blame for this partly on the left, that he said, look, farmers were ignored by the left for the most part. Farm aid and all that, but for the most part, they were ignored by the left. And so you get some guy and he's sitting there with, he's losing the farm. It's been in his family for generations. His wife has left, his kids have left. He's, got an empty bottle of Jack Daniels on the floor, and he's got a shotgun in his lap, wondering whether to put it in his mouth. And somebody knocks on the door. And he said, if that person knocks on the door and puts his arm around you and says, hey, buddy, let's talk, is a Mormon, the guy's going to become a Mormon. If he's a right-wing militia member, he's going to become a right-wing militia member. If he's a lefty, the guy's going to become a lefty. And the left wasn't doing it. And, okay, again, Tidney McVeigh did a horrible, horrible, horrible thing. I listened to some of the stuff he had to say, and if the left would have gotten to him instead of the right, he could have been a good anti-war activist. But the left has... Oh, and Michael Moore used to talk about the Michigan militia being the unemployed arm of the UAW. And at one point, the left cared about, or pretended to care at least, about those issues of wealth inequality and those issues of unemployment, those issues of destroying. I want to destroy the American infrastructure too, but I want to do it for ecological reasons, not to send stuff overseas. And it frustrates the hell out of me that a Democrat, Bill Clinton, signed NAFTA. And that's, I think, led to a lot. I know I'm way off topic. How do we deal with the fascism? The problem is, here's why I'm bringing up the left, is the left was supposed to be a bulwark against that fascism. But, maybe I'm full of crap, because if I look at history, we've got the reign of terror didn't come from the right. Reign of terror came from the left. And both left and right are completely capable of doing completely insane things. But I would also point out that the reign of terror is what led directly to Napoleon becoming dictator too. Napoleon had this great line about how I didn't seize the throne. I picked it up out of the gutter. Or I didn't seize the crown. I picked it up out of the gutter. And what do? I think we have these conversations. That's one of the things we have to do. And we don't retreat into cynicism, and we don't. I mean, it all comes back to me to food security. You know, it's like, if you've got food, then you can be independent and you can be an independent thinker. And it's crazy. I actually have a year's worth of supply, or year's supply of food, and I didn't get it for political reasons. Actually, I didn't get it. My mom got it, and then, you know, she died a few years ago. But my mom got it, and she got it. It's so funny, not because of peak oil, not because of, you know, impending fascism, but because two of my sisters are Mormons and they talked her into it. But it doesn't matter, because now I got food, and if the whole system collapses, then I'll be eating freeze-dried lasagna for a year. But anyway, the point, I'm making a joke about that, but the point is that that I think relocalize is the key, I think, to everything. Does that help at all?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Nice. JLo, did you have anything?
Yeah, I mean, you've already covered a lot of things I was interested in hearing about, so thank you. One of the things that I'm interested in, especially in regards to the whole idea of these different fighting factions, is the idea around population, because that's kind of a third rail, right? On the right, it's sacred. On the left, it becomes a racial issue.
Malthusian.
Exactly.
Oh, sorry, I didn't say it right. Malthusian.
Exactly. It's like, well, what the hell are we going to do with 10 billion people when we can't feed, you know, the 8 we have now, right? And when we collapse, there's less food. And
Yeah.
I'm saying that from the sense of, what's humanity going to do? And as you said, we drive towards fascism and go grab mine. And, you know, what's the population going to do? And do we have a chance of organized collapse, the way they drop a building into its footprint? Or are we really talking about something just scattering all over the place and taking everything out in its path?
Well, unfortunately, I think it's going to be the latter. But again, every cell in my body wants for it to be the former. And that's what I would, if I were in charge, that's what I would be aiming for. And population is a really interesting thing, because it could be solved easily. And study after study has shown that the single most important thing you can do in non-industrialized nations is to teach little girls to read. Because as soon as they have even that level of autonomy, they choose to have fewer children. And the whole discussion, okay, just the discussions about population crack me up for exactly the reason you said. First off, if you say there's too many humans on the planet, then everybody goes, oh my God, you must not like babies. It's like, actually, I don't really like babies, except with this really good barbecue sauce out of Kansas City. That's a joke. Anyway, as soon as we say that there's too many people on the planet, people accuse you of being racist, because the first thing that comes to mind is a little malnourished, pot-bellied kid in Mexico City. That's the first image that comes to mind for most people. And so they ignore, so I mean, basically, when the right talks about population, they ignore consumption. And when the left talks about consumption, they ignore population.
Right.
But they're both crazy. And one of the things that lets me know that all of our collective talk about population is just nuts. I'm not talking about yours or, you know, people who talk, like, I'm not talking about William Catton's discussion of it, which is completely sane. And by the way, I interviewed him in 1992, and he said, there's no way the planet can support 5.5 billion people. Yeah, you just wait, Bill. Anyway, the thing that lets me know it's all crazy is that when Russia and Japan get declining birth rates, they have sex holidays and send people home to try to have them have sex and get pregnant, because they're worried about the declining birth rate. Because everybody understands on some level, they don't articulate it, but they get it in their heart, that this system is a Ponzi scheme. And it has to continue. And it all goes back to, you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. And at some point, the bill's going to come due. It already came due for the passenger pigeons. It already came due for everybody on whom. Here's part of the problem, and I'll come back to population in a second. Part of the problem is that we are addicted to the system. And addict, I love that word, because it comes from the same root as the word edict. And it means to enslave, because back in ancient Rome, a judge would issue an edict addicting someone to someone else. You're now enslaved to that person. And this is how it works generally. I mean, we perceive people as being enslaved to the heroin. There's a great line about how he no longer drank from the bottle, but the bottle drank from him. And the thing is, the cliche about addiction is that addicts don't generally change till they hit bottom. And the problem with an addiction to power, this particular addiction, is that we're not the ones hitting bottom. So there's no reason for us to change. Everybody else is hitting bottom, but they're not the ones who are addicted. So anyway, we could stop overpopulation within a generation by giving women, more than 50% of the babies on the planet right now are not actively planned. So by giving women absolute reproductive freedom around the world, which means all we have to do is take on patriarchal monotheism and also the capitalist growth imperative. Those are the things that are standing in the way, really. I want to tell one more population story before we move on about population, which is that Iran of all places, interestingly enough, had a pretty successful approach to population growth. And this is post Khomeini. I mean, this is after the 78 or 79 or whatever year it was revolution, that they realized, I believe in the 80s, might have been the 90s, that they had a big population problem. And the way they approached it is through popular culture, that they would put in, well, first off, they destigmatized birth control, and they started preaching it to everybody and and they would go talk to people, and because they're very conservative, they would not say, they would sort of ease into the subject of birth control, but it was very successful there. And the thing that I find most interesting is they started intentionally putting plot devices in soap operas, where the main actress is going to get married, and so there's big discussions in the family. What will you do to prevent children? What do you think what birth control method might you use? And it was tremendously successful in dropping the birth rate just through popular propaganda. And I mean, I don't see that happening particularly here, but I find it, the thing that's interesting to me about population is that if we get impediments out of the way, major impediments like the capitalist and the monotheistic patriarchal stuff, most people don't actually want a ton of children. The reason traditionally they might have wanted a lot of children is because most of them died before they were the age of 5, but now they don't really. And so that seems to me that it leads to a big part of the problem. The problem is that the problems we face are not fundamentally rational, and therefore they're not amenable to rational solution. The problem is this addiction stuff, and the problem is, we can talk about this in terms of an entire culture having been traumatized for several thousand years, leading to people. I mean, it's interesting. Judith Herman talks about how those who've been traumatized often tend to perceive, and those who are raised in captivity and complex PTSD tend to perceive the entire world as consisting not of mutual relationships, but of consisting of power-based relationships, power over, etc. And after I talked to her about that, I could never look at Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene the same way again. That it's really a description of a traumatized worldview. And so many indigenous people have said to me that the fundamental difference between Western and indigenous ways of being is even most open-minded Westerners perceive listening to the natural world as a metaphor, as opposed to the way the world really works, the world really is. And as Vine Deloria said, that the sort of the point is, I mean, if you perceive the world as consisting of resources to be exploited, you'll treat it one way. And if you perceive the world as consisting of other beings to enter into relationship with, then you treat it completely differently. And so we can talk about the intractability of trauma response too. I mean, so the point is, population, I mean, it boggles my mind that we even have to talk about, the people even get mad when you say there's too many people on the planet. Like, everybody understands that. Like, there's this, I don't know if you've seen the movie from the 80s or 90s, Trip to Bountiful. Great movie, based on a play written in the 40s or 50s. And the plot is this old woman. It's set in the 40s or 50s, written in the 40s, 50s, made in the 80s or 90s. Anyway, this old woman wants to go home one more time to where she was as a young woman, and that's Bountiful. And she lives around Houston, and she, sort of sneaks out of the house, gets on a bus, and goes out for one last. I mean, I'm sobbing the whole movie. It's one of those sorts of things. And the thing, I sob for many reasons. One, it's a great movie. Another is that there's no way that movie could be made today, because when she gets to Bountiful, it's this beautiful field of bluebells. And I'm sorry, within 100 miles of Houston, are you kidding? It'd be strip malls today. I don't know anybody who wants to go back to where they grew up. I mean, I grew up just east of Boulder, Colorado. And when I grew up, Boulder, Louisville, Longmont, Lafayette, Niwot, Broomfield, Marshall were all separate, all completely separate. And now it's just one big thing. When I was a kid, we used to go up to Loveland, Colorado to every Valentine's Day to mail a letter to my grandma. So we have the Loveland stamp, postmark on it. And at that point, Loveland was basically a post office and 3 things. I was in Loveland 10 years ago. And for God's sake, it's like strip malls and hospitals and huge. And so I don't know how anybody can say, and this takes us back to the beginning, you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. I don't understand how there's anybody who doesn't understand that. And so, yeah, I wish that we were having sane, rational, reasonable conversations about population. Some guy, I did a talk to a bunch of students the other day, and one guy asked, so what's the single most important thing you think I can do? And I said, get a vasectomy. And I mean, personal change doesn't matter. I mean, it doesn't matter if somebody has, I mean, that actually, personal change is irrelevant on the social level, but that still, it's like, it's just so easy. I got a vasectomy when I was 40. And the only thing I regret is I didn't get it when I was 20.
Nice. Well,
I thought it was going to hurt.
We're running up against our time, but it seems like one sort of concluding idea that often comes up in these conversations is, what about hope? Because everybody's asking about hope. And I know you have a lot of opinions about that. And I think that might be a good way to wrap some of this.
Great. Oh, yeah, I'm happy to. Thank you. Well, first, I think we need to separate hope from false hope. This friend sent me, back in the 90s, a friend sent me a bunch of, he found out I was HIV positive. He sent me a bunch of literature about it. And there was one line in there that really got me, which was, eliminate false hope. I think eliminating false hope is one of the most important things we can do. We have to do it ruthlessly. And I believe there are problems with Western medicine, but I really like the Western medical model of, I have Crohn's disease. And when the doctor came in to tell me, we got the results of the biopsy, you have Crohn's disease, he didn't come in and he didn't, if he was an environmentalist, he would have come in and said, well, so you don't have leprosy. That's good. And, but he didn't. He just walked in and said, so I'm sorry, it came back as you got Crohn's disease. And then he left and let me cry for an hour. And then he came back and we talked about options. And it's like and this goes back to the population thing. I've got a friend, John Osborne, who's both a doctor and environmentalist. And he always says, correct diagnosis is the first step toward proper treatment. And same with population, with all this. So anyway, get rid of false hope. Just let's take those out. I mean, does anybody really think that if we we have a Democrat in the White House, does anybody really think that if the Democrats control the House and the Senate and everything else and the Supreme Court, that environmentally things will be okay. You know, my father was abusive, and one of the reasons that my mother stayed with him is because there weren't battered women's shelters in the 50s and 60s. But another reason she stayed with him is because of the false hope that he would change. That's one reason I'm so big on, are we going to have a voluntary transformation? That's a false hope I think we need to just ruthlessly eradicate. So, okay, that's false hope. But then hope, I was bashing hope one day in a talk I did 20 years ago, and somebody in the audience shouts out, "What's your definition of hope?" I was like, oh my God, I don't know. I've been bashing hope for years and I have no idea what I'm talking about. And so me and the audience together came up with our definition of hope, which I really like, which is hope is a longing for a future condition over which you have no agency. Hope is a longing for a future condition over which you have no agency. And that's how we use it in everyday language. I don't hope that I'm going to eat something today. I'm going to do it. But, excuse me, next time I get on an airplane, I hope it doesn't crash. That's out of my control. A woman came up to me, Terry Tempest Williams, actually, after I did a talk bashing hope, and she came up to me and she said, "So are you saying I can't hope my brother survives cancer?" I said, "No, I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is you can't stand there with car keys in your hand and say, I hope you make it to the hospital." So what my bashing hope is about figuring out what we do and don't have agency over. And when people say, I hope salmon survive, if they're not doing anything to help salmon survive, that's just an obscenity. It's not, you're not actually doing anything. You're acknowledging you have no agency over it. I mean, it's very simple. What do salmon need to survive? They need for dams to be removed. They need for industrial logging to stop, industrial fishing to stop, global warming to stop, and the murder of the oceans to stop. They need those 5 things. There's no hope involved. Well, there is actually hope involved. If you're not doing those things, you say, yeah, I hope and I pray for the salmon. It's like, you're not doing anything. But this very smart Anishinaabe woman once wrote to me and said, I think hope and prayer do play a role in this. And, oh, wait, I want to back up a second. And again, this is how we use it in everyday language. That I was doing a talk one time, my mom was in the audience, and people are going, you know, I'm talking about hope. And I said, you know, when I was a kid, if my mom would have said, clean your room, and I would have said, I hope the room gets clean, it would have been a total non-starter. And I said, I pointed to my mom and I said, Mom, if I would have said, I hope the room gets clean, what would you have said? And she immediately responded, I would have said, you better hope the room gets clean. And that's how we use it in everyday language. When it comes to these larger issues, it's like, gosh, I hope the salmon survive. I hope global warming doesn't go to 5 degrees. I hope that this, I hope that that. And so anyway, where hope does play a role is that if the dams are removed, and if industrial logging is stopped, and if industrial fishing is stopped, and if the oceans stop being murdered, and if global warming stops, whichever one of those is left, then you have to hope and pray that the river accepts your offering. And the river, then it's up to the salmon. It's not up to the salmon to clean up our mess. It's up to the salmon to come back or not once we do everything we can. No, we don't do everything we can. We do everything necessary. There's a difference. We do everything necessary. It's like, I hope that global warming stops. Okay, here's another way to look at this. If space aliens came down from outer space, I guess that's where they come from, and they were changing the climate, and they were vacuuming the oceans, and they were putting docks in every mother's breast milk, we would know what to do. The problem is that it's the system to which we have pledged allegiance since we were born. And that's why the George Monbiot thing is so important. It's not our brick factories, it's their brick factories. It's our forest of whom we are a part. It's not our forest like we own it. It's our forest like our family. Or it's our desert like it's our family. And again, that's not the same as ownership. It's our as responsibility as opposed to our as ownership. And anyway, so I think that hope plays an important role. But what I'm really interested in is agency and figuring out what you are capable of and what is required of you. And then after that, you get to hope, but not until then.
Nice. Well, when you might remember, we talked a couple of years ago about hope, and there was this parable or quip somebody brought forth: hope makes a terrible breakfast, but it makes a great supper.
That
The
was
idea
great.
being that you go out, you do your work, and at the end of the day, before you go to bed, you're entitled to hope for a better tomorrow. But if you haven't done your work, then
You don't get any supper.
yeah.
I love that.
Yeah. Very nice. Well, Derrick, this has been just a super pleasure. We could have you on all day, every day, for example. But we'll be happy to let you go unless you guys have anything else.
Well,
No,
I
it's
can do
been
one more
very-
quick one if you want.
It's been very helpful.
Good.
Thank you.
I didn't hear what you said, Derrick. I'm sorry.
Oh, I said I can do one more quick one if you want, or not. Either way. And also, I'm happy to do this again sometime.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was going to say that it'd be good to meet up again in a few months and talk about some other issues.
Great. I love it.
Yeah.
It's been wonderful.
We'll keep you in the loop, and we'll let you know when this thing goes up and is available. And yeah, we're just wishing you all the best on your projects and your writing, and looking forward to talking again when we can.
Thanks. Me too. You.
Yeah.
Keep it up. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thanks so
Thank you.
much. Have a great day.
Cheers, Derrick. I hope you've enjoyed our conversation with Derrick Jensen. If you'd like to learn more about Activism is Medicine, simply visit our website, activismismedicine.net, and we hope to see you next time.